On the 18th of April 1962, a demolition foreman named Wendell Tarr, 49 years old, and 2 decades into stripping fixtures out of buildings the state no longer wanted, put a crowbar through a plastered wall at the old Ashwell County Asylum outside Cutter's Gap, West Virginia. Behind it ran a hallway that appeared on no blueprint his crew had been issued. 6 cells opened off that hallway, doors long gone, and in the first one an iron ring sat bolted into the brick at the height of a grown man's chest. A chain still hung from the ring. The chain still held a set of iron cuffs. And when Tarr's flashlight finally reached the far corner of the cell, the cuffs were not empty. The asylum had closed 3 years earlier. Its patients moved that same fall to a new consolidated hospital outside Charleston, its case file boxed and driven off to the state archive, its buildings sold off for salvage. Nothing in that transfer paperwork mentioned a 6th wing. Nothing in the county's own copy of the building plans showed one either. Tarr had worked asylum demolitions in 3 other counties before this one, and he had learned to expect strange rooms turning up behind a crowbar. A padded cell nobody had logged. A basement dissecting room left exactly as the last physician walked out of it. What he had not expected was a hallway sealed at both ends, plastered and painted to match the corridor it interrupted, built to be forgotten by anyone who had not already been told it was there. Tarr called the other 3 men off their ladders before he went further than the first cell. None of them touched anything until the sheriff arrived from the county seat 2 hours later, and the 4 of them stood in the corridor in the meantime, lanterns raised, counting the rings out loud as though saying the number would make it smaller. 6 rings, 6 cells, 1 occupant left where he had been left. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Cutter's Gap sits 11 miles from the Ashwell County seat by a road that switches back 6 times climbing out of the valley, and in 1873, when the State Board of Managers chose the site for its Western Hospital, that distance was the entire point. The board wanted land the railroad had not reached yet, cheap because nobody else wanted it, remote enough that a patient who wandered off the grounds would meet the mountains before he met a farmer. Construction ran 4 years, using stone quarried and timber cut on the property itself, and by 1890 the finished hospital held close to 600 patients in wards built for roughly half that number. Overcrowding of that kind was ordinary for a state asylum in this period. Boards across the country accepted more patients than their wards could properly hold, because the alternative, leaving the mentally ill in county jails and almshouses, was worse, and every annual report said so without much argument from the legislature. What set Ashwell apart from its sister institutions was never written down as policy anywhere the board could be held to it. It shows up only later, and only as a gap the width of a hallway. The oversight that was supposed to catch a gap like that ran on a fixed schedule, which is exactly what made it easy to plan around. State inspectors visited each asylum once a year, announced weeks in advance by letter, and their inspections followed a printed checklist: ward cleanliness, food stores, staffing ratios, the general condition of patients presented for review. An inspector walked the wards he was shown, and signed a form confirming what he had seen. He did not measure the building against its own blueprints, because no inspector in this period carried blueprints, and he had no authority to demand a hallway be opened that the superintendent's own floor plan did not show. The system trusted the man running the hospital to disclose what existed inside it. Ashwell's superintendents, one after another for close to 70 years, simply declined to. Read the surviving casebooks, and the hospital looks, on paper, like one of the better ones. Its yearly reports to the legislature list discharge rates among the highest of any asylum in the region, patients admitted, treated, and released as cured within a year or 2, figures the board quoted with visible satisfaction at budget hearings in Charleston. A hospital producing numbers like that renewed its appropriation without a fight most years. A hospital producing numbers like that also needed, as investigators would eventually work out, somewhere to put the patients whose numbers refused to cooperate. The county coroner who examined the remains in that first cell kept his report to measurements, the way a physician of his training was taught to. A male skeleton, 5 feet 6 inches at full extension. An old fracture across the left forearm, healed without a splint, the bone having knit at a slight permanent bend. No clothing remained except a leather collar, buckled at the neck, stiff with age but still fastened shut. Toothwear consistent with a man past 60. Nothing about the remains indicated a cause of death. Something did indicate how long the man had likely been restrained before it came. The wrist bones inside the cuffs carried grooves worn smooth into the surface, the kind a joint develops only after years of being pulled against an edge that never gave. 2 of the remaining 5 cells held no remains at all, only the rings, the chains, and a floor swept curiously clean. 3 held partial skeletal material, badly disturbed, along with a scatter of small belongings, a tin cup, a comb missing half its teeth, and in the cell furthest from the entrance, wedged into a gap in the mortar where a hand could reach but a search from the corridor never would, a folded scrap of paper with a name written on it in an unsteady hand. Ezra Coale. No date. No further explanation offered. The county could not match that name to a single surviving Ashwell intake record. One witness could still speak to what the paperwork could not. Odessa Kern, 61 years old in 1962, had worked as a ward attendant at Ashwell from 1938 until the hospital's closing in 1959, and when the state investigator found her in a boarding house 2 counties over, she did not act surprised to be asked about the West Annex. She had fed men through a slot in a door that officially did not exist for 21 years, she said, washed them, changed their bedding, and never once been given a name to go with a face. Numbers only, stitched onto collars, and an instruction repeated to every attendant assigned there on her first day, whatever you see past that door stays past that door. She had assumed, she told the investigator, that everyone above her understood what she did not. She had been wrong about that. Almost nobody above her had understood anything either, because almost nobody above the superintendent's office had ever been told the annex existed at all. Kern remembered 6 men behind that door across her 21 years there, never more than 6 at once, and she remembered that when one died, the ring stayed empty for a time, and then, eventually, did not. She was never told where a replacement came from, only handed a new number to stitch onto a new collar and told to carry on as before. She remembered the youngest of them clearly, a man the staff referred to only as 11, who could not have been much past 20 when she first saw him, and who spent his last several years there singing the same 4 bars of a hymn under his breath, over and over, until even the other attendants stopped noticing it as sound. She did not know his real name either. She said that was the part she had never been able to set down. Decades later, in a boarding house 2 counties from the hospital that had employed her, that a man could sing the same 4 bars for years within arm's reach of the people who fed him, and not one of them had ever once been permitted to ask him what it meant. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The State Hospital Board sent an investigator from Charleston within the week, a career auditor named Garrett Loy who had spent 11 years reviewing institutions nobody in the capital much wanted to think about. Loy's own notes, later filed alongside his final report, record him standing in that hallway with the county sheriff and asking a question neither man could answer that day. How does a working wing of a hospital go 2 years, 10 years, 30 years without a single supply requisition, a single laundry order, a single line entered into any maintenance log, and never once draw a question from anyone whose job was to notice things like that? The answer was not standing in the hallway with them. It was sitting 3 counties away, in the private papers of a physician who had left Ashwell 40 years before. Loy's report, filed with the State Board that August, runs to 61 pages, most of them procedural. Chain of custody for the remains, a room-by-room inventory of the annex, correspondence with the coroner's office, a list of every superintendent who had served at Ashwell since its founding, and the dates each one's tenure began and ended. It is a document built by a careful man doing careful work, And it says, in its final paragraph, something closer to plain feeling than anything else in it. Loy wrote that he had reviewed the personnel and inspection files of 11 state hospitals in his career and had never before found an institution whose written record contained no reference, however oblique, to a facility later proven to have existed for at least 6 decades. He called that fact, in his own words, harder to account for than the cells themselves. A wall can be built by one determined man in an afternoon. A silence that size takes a great many ordinary people, each one telling himself he is simply not the one who needs to ask. Dr. Aldous Vane served as Ashwell's medical superintendent from 1890 until 1922, and for most of that span his name sits beside some of the strongest discharge figures any West Virginia asylum reported to the legislature. He resigned in the spring of 1922, 9 days after a routine state inspection, and left the following month for a quieter post at a private sanitarium in Virginia, a lateral move that made little sense for a man of his standing and record. His resignation letter survives in the state archive, 4 sentences long, citing his health and thanking the board for its confidence. It says nothing about the annex, almost nothing in the official record ever does. Ashwell was not the only asylum where this shape turns up, once a person learns to recognize it. In 1948, a boiler crew replacing pipe in the basement of the Amity Ridge home for the feeble-minded in eastern Tennessee broke through a sealed stairwell leading to a level absent from the facility's own floor plan and found 4 cells built to the same design as Ashwell's, rings set at chest height, chains long enough to reach a cot but never a door. 19 years after that, workmen renovating the old county asylum at Blackwater Forks in eastern Kentucky opened a bricked archway behind a supply room and found the arrangement a 3rd time, down to the leather collars buckled at the neck. Both institutions had reported discharge rates that outpaced their neighbors for decades. Both had a superintendent who resigned abruptly within days of a state inspection and moved on to quieter work within the year. Neither case produced the men who had actually closed the walls, only the walls themselves, still holding the people whose existence those walls had been built to erase. What ties the 3 sites together most tightly is not the architecture, though the architecture is identical closely enough to suggest the plans passed between institutions rather than being invented 3 separate times by coincidence. It is the language. Attendants at Amity Ridge in 1948 and a groundskeeper at Blackwater Forks in 1967, questioned decades apart by investigators who had never spoken to each other, used nearly the same phrase to describe what they had been told on their first day in each building, that whatever they saw past that door was not something the hospital discharged, only something it stopped counting. Neither witness could have read the other's statement. Neither hospital's staff manual has survived to explain where either of them learned to say it that way. What the Ashwell record refuses to say is louder than what it admits. The hospital's patient intake ledger for the years 1894 through 1906 survives in the state archive as a single volume with 40 consecutive pages missing, not torn out, but cut close along the spine with a blade, the stubs trimmed even enough that a clerk paging through quickly would notice nothing wrong. An internal memorandum referenced in the hospital's own budget correspondence, dated the winter of 1898 and addressed to Dr. Vane, recommends what its listed subject line calls immediate review of annex capacity. The memorandum itself was never filed with the state board, and it has never surfaced. Only its subject line survives, copied onto an index card by a records clerk decades later, cataloguing a document that had already stopped existing by the time anyone thought to look for it. The census returns tell a smaller version of the same story. Ashwell reported its resident population to the state every June for 70 years, and the reported total never once included a figure for the West Annex, though the hospital's own coal and food deliveries, still itemized in surviving purchase orders, show consumption consistently higher than the officially counted population could account for. Nobody auditing a coal bill in 1895 had any reason to wonder why an institution of 600 souls seemed to be feeding closer to 606. Loy's investigation eventually turned up one document, Vane's successors never managed to reach, because it had left the building years before anyone thought to search for it. A junior physician at Ashwell in the 1890s, a man named Corwin Absalom, who left the hospital service in 1899 for a clinic in Roanoke, kept his own private notes on hospital business, the habit of a young doctor who never expected anyone else to read them. Among those notes, folded into a case journal his family donated to a local historical society decades after his death, is a single page in Vane's own hand, apparently issued to Absalom as an internal directive and never returned to the office it came from. What follows is taken from that page exactly as it reads. Patients classed incurable after 2 years' treatment place a burden on our reported outcomes that the board cannot be made to understand or accept. Effective this quarter, such patients are to be recorded as discharged to family care and transferred instead to the West Annex for continued residence under this office's direct supervision. Family correspondence in these cases need not be pursued further. This arrangement is not to appear in any report leaving this office, in any form, under any circumstance. There is no wrestling in that page, no confession working itself loose. It reads like a man closing out a column of figures that had stopped balancing in his favor. That is what makes it worse than a confession would have been. A confession admits that something went wrong. This document never once entertains the possibility that anything had. The West Annex is still standing, though the hospital around it is not. Ashwell County preserved the sealed wing as a small historical exhibit, when the rest of the building came down that same summer, a decision made less out of reverence than out of a county attorney's caution about demolishing a site that had just produced human remains and a name nobody could account for. The 6 cells stand open to visitors today, the rings still bolted into brick that has never been repainted, the chains still coiled exactly where investigators left them after cataloguing each one by weight and length. Ezra Coale's name has never been matched to any admission record the state can locate. The collar taken from the first cell sits, still buckled, in a glass case with a printed card that lists only what a coroner could measure with a tape and a scale. A hospital that told the legislature it cured its patients had built a second hospital beside the first one, out of the same stone, to hold the ones it could not, and had written those men out of their own existence while they were still breathing inside the walls built to hide them. The figures Ashwell reported to Charleston every year for 3 decades were real figures, carefully kept and neatly filed. They were simply never about the people the state believed they described. Wendell Tarr gave one statement to the county paper before he went back to demolition work at a hospital 2 states away, and it was shorter than anything Loy ever wrote. He said he had spent 20 years pulling buildings apart looking for whatever the last owner left behind, and had never once, before that April afternoon, found a room that had been built for the sole purpose of making sure nobody came looking. He said the part that stayed with him was not the chain, or the collar, or the note with Ezra Coale's name pressed into it by a hand that had nothing else left to press into anything. It was the plaster. Somebody had troweled that wall smooth, let it cure, and painted it to match the hallway on either side, taking real care over work meant only to be looked at and believed, never once opened again. A man does not do careful work like that unless some part of him expects, even hopes, that it will hold forever. This one held for 68 years. It came down in an afternoon, under a crowbar swung by a man who had never heard of Ezra Coale, Odessa Kern, or the 4 bars of a hymn that nobody left alive can now finish. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.